Hello and welcome to Teaching Tuesdays, brought to you by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. My name is Dr. Kristen Burton, and today we are going to be talking about teaching with oral histories. Oral histories do provide educators at all grade levels an invaluable resource in helping to teach the past to their students, because through first-person eyewitness accounts conveyed through the spoken word, rather than words written on a page, the past can come to life in a unique way. Through the power of one's voice, students can gain glimpses into these events as experienced by the individual. But like with other primary sources, these oral histories do require a level of analysis and critical assessment, so students can understand who is speaking, what they are speaking about, and how those individual experiences fit into broader historical narratives. Oral histories make up a significant part of the collection at the National World War II Museum, beginning initially with Dr. Stephen Ambrose's own collections that he began gathering in the 1980s. The National World War II Museum today houses roughly 7,000 oral histories and counting, and every day the museum is reaching out to veterans to capture their stories or the stories of any individual who lived through World War II, so we can preserve this history and the voices of those who lived through it. Now, unfortunately, time is against us, as roughly 300 or so veterans pass every single day. So in what is an actual race against the clock, the National World War II Museum is working to collect as many of these stories as possible before they're gone. Through digitizing efforts at the National World War II Museum, more and more oral histories are becoming available to educators all the time. And through the vast collection offered by the museum, educators can help their students learn about the experiences of those who both served abroad and those who helped contribute to the war effort on the home front. Now, looking through some of these examples that we'll cover in this video, but also other ones you can access through the WWII-classroom.org website and also through WWIIonline.org, educators can find an endless number of personal stories to help teach the history of World War II. But how can teachers use these oral histories to teach about the past? Well, like with all primary sources, teachers and students alike must approach oral histories with a critical eye. As with all primary sources, it's important to understand who is speaking, who is the intended audience, what is the length of time from the moment that a person is recounting to the time that they are recounting the story, and how might that affect the process of preserving one's historical memory. Now, with oral histories, it's important to remember that unlike a written primary source, it is an interview, and it is a constructed source made by the interviewer and interviewee. Through questions, the process of the experience of recounting one's lived experience during the war is guided by the person asking those questions. Now, through oral histories that you will find on WWIIonline.org, interviewers are careful with the way they navigate this process, starting with an individual's early life and taking the story all the way through to the end of the war, and sometimes even well after. But it is important to remember it is a constructed space. It's a constructed experience through the process of question and answer. Now, this can provide students with an additional opportunity for critical analysis, because as students approach all documents, they must also approach primary sources with an analytical eye. Now let's take a look at two examples from the museum's collection from its 4th volume in its Collection to the Classroom curriculum series, Liberation and Legacy. And through these two examples, we will see two different perspectives around the subject of liberation. One from the perspective of a liberator, and the other from the perspective of a liberated prisoner. The first one is going to come from Harold BERKMAN, and the second from Ava SCHLOSS. Take a look.
At any rate, once again, we're moving. We're moving toward Erfurt, and now on the 12th and 13th of April, we're approaching Weimar. And outside of Weimar, we hit the concentration camp, Buchenwald. And this is the first time that Americans had ever seen a concentration camp. We were one of the first GIs. I was one of the first GIs in Buchenwald. When I walked into Buchenwald, and my company walked into Buchenwald, the ovens were still warm. The inmates were 70 pounds, 75 pounds, undernourished. I saw bones where the furnaces were stacked high, and that's another thing you never forget. Now, Patton saw this, and Patton notified Eisenhower immediately because they had never seen a concentration camp before. And Patton and Eisenhower walked through the concentration camp. Now,
tell me about that day. Tell me about the day you were liberated.
Well, you know, liberation, you imagine a happy day. Well, we were in Birkenau, and this is very important. Birkenau was a women's camp where was much more primitive than Auschwitz, with the main big. Birkenau was in a way bigger in size, but Auschwitz was more the main camp where the Germans had more headquarters, and where the Russians later made their headquarters as well for this area. But in Birkenau there was really just the camps. There were many camps, A, B, C, D, and every camp was surrounded by electrified barbed wire. So if you were in B camp or C camp, you didn't know what was really happening in other parts of the camp. But there were at that time already, most of the people had gone, but there were still a few hundred people behind, and the Germans wanted to take everybody. And so some SS were still there, most of them had left already. And there were air raids because the Russians were bombarding around the area. They were never bombarding the camp. But the Germans didn't want to march while the planes were running over this area. So they had called us out for a couple of days, several times a day. They said, all out of the barrack, we are marching. And we came out and wanted to march because we didn't want to be burned alive. And most of the people who could still walk were standing there as well. And so that went on for many days, in and out, in and out. And then one evening they called out again, everybody out, we are marching. And I said to my mother was very, very weak. She would not have survived a single day on this march. And I said, well, look, they're probably not marching anyway. They'll probably come back again in a few hours, so let's not go outside. And we stayed in the barrack, and we fell asleep. And, you know, we were completely exhausted. And in the morning we woke up, and they had gone. Some of the inmates with the Germans had left the camp. And there were only about 300 of us left. And most of those people were really very, very ill and not even able to get down from their bunks. And that was, in a way, freedom, you know. We could have walked out, the gates were open, but of course we didn't know what was outside. We didn't know, was there anybody, were the Germans outside, were the Russians outside, what would the Russians do, and so on. So.
Now, these two oral histories provide powerful perspectives and insight into what is a very dark and yet significant moment in history that students must learn about. But through these oral histories, we can see two individuals who are recounting events that happened decades prior to the moment in which they're telling this story. How might that passage of time affect historical memory, personal or broader understandings of historical events that has changed over time? Now, when it comes to something as traumatic as the Holocaust, we may wonder if those memories might be seared so deeply into an individual's memory that they would never forget a single detail about that experience. And yet we cannot assume, because we do not know that individual or how they may recall the past. This is always going to be an unknown factor when approaching a subject like oral histories. An individual may intentionally try to forget what happened, and with good cause. And yet, when they do revisit these past events, it can affect the way they recount the events of their life. So this is always going to be a factor when teachers and students alike approach these resources. Now, looking at these two oral histories, a number of details do stand out. First, taking the example of Harold Berkman's oral history, you'll see that he's referencing notes as he recounts his experiences. This is an interesting detail to point out to your students, as not all individuals who give oral histories rely on such supplementary materials. This can help support one's memory or help them to recall instances they may otherwise forget. But when it comes to the oral history of Ava Schloss, you can see that she is reliving these experiences. And in a similar way, so was Harold Berkman. Because there is the moment when he's first recounting that moment of entering Buchenwald, when his eyes move away from the notes, and you can see he is back in that space. And with Ava Schloss, she's reliving it, but you can see the distance between her retelling of her experiences and her reliving of it. So there's some distinction between these two examples, and there is room for analysis of why that may be. We may never know the answers of how and why a person recounts a memory from the past the way they do, but in trying to understand, students can gain valuable insight into these past events and develop their critical thinking skills while also expanding their own resources of empathy and understanding of the past. When bringing oral histories into your classroom, you offer students valuable first-person insight into past events. And they are significant perspectives to bring into the teaching of the past and the history of World War II. But there are also valuable resources in helping students elevate and expand their own critical thinking skills as they analyze these sources the same way they would analyze any primary source. And it opens up important discussions between memory and documented sources and what that may offer in broader interpretation of what events happened in the past, as well as their broader significance to the history of the world overall. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and found it useful for your own teaching. Please check out www.classroom.org for more resources, including lesson plans, essays, additional oral histories, interactive maps, and a litany of other resources you can put to use in your own classroom to teach the history of World War II. From Dr. Kristen Burton and the National World War II Museum, thank you very much, and take care.